Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, when it comes to becoming ridiculously strong in this game, there are so many different ways to do it. But one of the easiest ways to make most bosses in this game just feel inordinately easier is simply bleed. Whether it is the focus of your build entirely, or just a side mechanism that you use to buff your physical damage with things like the White Mask Helmet or Lord of Blood's Talisman that boost all damage that you deal for a short duration after a bleed happens nearby, no matter how you do it, bleed is fantastic. That said, with how strong it was in the base game, a lot of people expected the developers to make it much worse comparatively in the DLC, either by adding resistant or immune bosses in important spots, or just by nerfing the status in general. However, what actually happened is we got like one or two major bosses that are resistant to bleed, not even anything that's really fully immune, and it is just super useful against some of the otherwise hardest bosses of the expansion. And on top of all of its power from the base game, there are a couple of new ways to scale bleed builds up even further within the expansion itself that honestly make very little sense when considering just how strong those builds were before. And of course, the fact that bleed builds already benefit from the more general damage increases that were added, like Rakshasa armor, or the new blood-sucking crystal tier that gives you a 20% boost to all damage done while it's active. That said, today we'll go over the new ways of affecting specifically bleed builds, what they affect precisely, and what they may deceptively not actually do, as well as talking about the new Bloodflame Incantation and why it is quite literally broken in the sense of not functioning as it should or as intended. Then we'll talk about a great example of just a bleed build from the base game that was already really insane that has just sort of shot up into space with its damage output in the DLC. First up then, what are the new avenues of power specific to bleed builds in the DLC? Well, one that is extremely interesting for a number of reasons is Sacred Bloody Flesh. This is a new consumable item that buffs you in the body buff slot, meaning its main competition is Flame Grant Me Strength because these will not stack. Flame Grant Me Strength boosts your physical and fire damage specifically by 20% for 30 seconds. This consumable, however, gives you 10 arcane by default, which is great for any build that scales with the stat. Then it boosts your damage by around 8% for 30 seconds. But then if a bleed happens nearby you within that time window, it gives you a much larger secondary buff that in total with the base increase is around a 27% damage increase from before you had any buffs. That's 7% higher than what Flame Grant Me Strength would give you, and importantly, it applies to all damage types that you could deal rather than just the two that Flame Grant Me Strength does, giving it far more versatility and value as long as you have bleed in your build in some way. This item is super strong in the right setup, but it unfortunately is not craftable. It has to be farmed, and the best way generally to do so is by killing blood fiend enemies, though the drop rate is relatively low. The best spot for this is inside of the Rivermouth Cave in the north side of Elak River. This specific spot, if you just progress through the cave, is right before the boss room of the area, where you can find a massive pack of these guys that can all be killed by a single swing of the Sacred Relic Sword, unique skill from the base game. You may be thinking, this is quite far from Magrace, how do we reset this and do it again? Well, it is right beside the boss room of the cave. If you still have the boss alive, you can just walk in, die to them, and respawn at the Stake of Marika that is right outside of the room with all these enemies alive. Or if your boss is dead, you can actually unalive yourself using something like the Seppuku Ash of War, and as long as you do it in the boss room, you will get the Stake of Marika revival option. Repeat this as long as you want, and good luck on the flesh. Outside of that, the main booster of blood-based builds in the DLC is the new armor set from Anshbach, the NPC. This is something that you can't get until relatively deep into the DLC, but it can be traded from friends or used in subsequent playthroughs, and the special bonus effect on the armor is relatively unique, with the helmet itself giving a 6% damage boost, and then the other three pieces being 3% each for a total of 15% increase to specifically blood-based weapon skills, meaning this doesn't apply to attacks or to magic, only to the actual weapon skills. However, that means if you are running something like Rivers of Blood as your main weapon, even now in 2024, this set will boost the damage of its skill around twice as much as just wearing Rakshasa armor would. Obviously, you would undoubtedly pair this with the White Mask Helmet, which means that you still get around 9% increase from wearing this over the wearing normal armor with White Mask, or a 3% increase over 3 pieces of Rakshasa. So it's not insane without the helmet, but also not negligible by any means in the right setup for it. That said, let's talk about what it affects. As mentioned, Rivers of Blood counts, as does Reduvia, which is arguably nearly equally as ridiculous once people worked out how to use it properly. This also boosts Eleonora's Pole Blades weapon unique skill, which is extremely fun to actually use, as well as the unique skill of the Bloody Hellas Heavy Thrusting Sword, Dynas Finesse, and the new Obsidian Lamina Scythe, which also comes from anshbach, so it makes sense that it would actually apply to his weapon skill too, honestly. On top of that, it applies to some infusible Ashes of War, specifically the ever-popular Blood Tax, which we did a revamped build with recently, Bloodblade, the more simply blood-based Ash of War, and then it finally also affects Bloody Slash 2. As for whether the armor is worth for any of those weapons, weapons, it sort of depends on the build and playstyle that you are using around them. Are you constantly using the weapon skill? If so, then yeah, the armor is great. If you are doing anything but the weapon skill, even 40% of the time I would say in proper combat, then it is suddenly not at all worth it quite as much at all. So it requires a bit of thought to actually work it out for your setup. That said, there is a little bit more to this though, because then there is also a very interesting thing that you may have noticed I didn't mention in that list, given what the armor says that it does, and that is the weapon skill of Mohg's Sacred Spear. This, for whatever reason, despite being very clearly a bleed weapon skill, a blood oath skill even, does not in fact count for this. Theoretically, you could argue it's because blood oath means that it's in service to Mohg, but personally I think it's more in service to Mohg's god, of course, and so Mohg's skill should count, but it doesn't, at least, for now. Moving on then, there is one more interesting new sort of bleed build component to talk about here, which is Furious Blade of anshbach. This is an incantation that comes from fully finishing anshbach's NPC questline, which does require you to finish the DLC. And we do have a guide on the questlines on the channel itself, but before you see this and get too excited about it, you may want to sort of set a reminder to check this one out after the next major patch, because this one is actually just straight up not working properly at this moment. Specifically, its whole purpose is Bloodflame and applying Bloodflame and, of course, doing damage while it does so. The major advantage of Bloodflame is that it applies growing bleed buildup over time, rather than just for each individual weapon hit like normal bleed, so consistency of hits is better than just pure speed. But for whatever reason, there is simply no bleed buildup actually applied from the Bloodflame effect of this incantation specifically. Half if not more of the actual point of using the incantation is to apply bleed. So currently it's just sort of a significantly underpowered, relatively pop of damage because the status application is just non-existent on it. And I don't mean that like, oh, it's just a little bit undertuned. No, it just does not apply bleed at all in the first place, despite what it is supposed to be doing, clearly. This one is pretty disappointing because it is honestly an extremely promising incantation to potentially build around. But that is only true if the Bloodflame is actually functional. So for now, this is absolutely trash. But the second that it actually works, you may well see it come into its own quite quickly. So basically this is currently dead in the water, but keep an eye out for the future patch notes to hopefully fix this one up for us. Finally then, to sort of pin the tail on this donkey, so to say, there are tons of super solid bleed builds in the game, and they're just getting even better. But the best reference point for this is the jumping scavenger curved sword build that we made to completely destroy the base game way back when it first released. And, this has always been incredibly strong, but due to the various general damage increases, then made even more insane with the use of sacred bloody flesh as a bleed build specific buff, this just hits for absolutely stupid numbers now. We talked about the new and improved build in more detail on the channel quite recently, but for a more brief rundown, you just want a couple of scavengers curved swords power stanced with occult scaling. If you don't have two, a bandit's curved sword set to bleed will also do the job here, just a bit worse. And then you have to just put together white mask, jump attack, boost chest piece, Rakshasa gauntlets and greaves, and then the talismans for bleed bonuses, multi-hit bonuses, and then also jump attacks of course too. The true beauty of this is in the DLC is that there are ways to actually retool this quite easily to be a sprint attack focused build that functions nearly identically, just swapping a chest piece and then a talisman, but still just as strong as the jumping version, with the main trade-off being that some bosses are easier to use sprint attacks against, and some are just much easier to use jump attacks on. As simple as that. That just about does it for today then, everyone. The new bleed build specific buffs, what precisely they do and what they affect, how they work, how to get them into your build, what they don't work with, and then just some talk about the new Bloodflame incantation, and the best example of a bleed build that improved a hefty amount in the DLC as far as the actual damage output of it. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and hopefully it helps you out on your journey to remove the blood from any enemy that you see in this game. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.